Thank you. We've all had lunch and hopefully feeling awake enough to get through a few more sessions today before the party starts, right? There's a networking reception in the exhibit hall. Please make sure you get there. It's going to be a good time. My name's Robert Reinhardt. I've presented this session under various titles since last May, so I think this is the third time I've done an 265 versus 264 session, and specifically it's H.265 versus H.264. And what's interesting about this talk for me is that I get to see how things are changing over time. And in the world and the ecosystems that we live in, some things can change overnight, literally by a code change to the repository with one of these codecs, or it just takes a long time for traction to build up. I did 2 workshops yesterday, and I think really just as a quick intro to this, the biggest hurdle for 265 when it comes to playback is the GPU side of things. We've been afforded the luxury of 264 being around for a pretty long time now in internet years and in video years, and it's had enough time to build up the mass that it has. So I don't think 264 is going away anytime soon, but 265 clearly has some benefits to offer. My contact information, if you want to tweet anything about this session. I mean, heck, we just went to a Twitter session this morning at that keynote, some interesting information there. Please feel free to let me know what you're doing with 265. I like to see what folks are doing. I know in my FFmpeg session yesterday, quite a few have already started to experiment with 265. I would encourage you to do it if you haven't. And let's just get right into it. The good news is that H.265 continues to live up to the hype. We're seeing the same quality at lower bit rates compared to H.264. And again, for all intensive purposes, you can insert X.264 and X.265, very specific implementations of H.264 as a codec. And you'll see that I've crossed out now each time I've presented. This is the third time I'm presenting this session. The first time I presented, my average file size ratio for X.264 to X.265, all things trying to be kept equal in terms of encoding parameters, I've seen it jump from 1.5 to 1 to 1.64 to 1, finally to what we heard in the industry, the promise of HEVC or 265, and that's a 2-to-1 ratio. I've seen some clips go slightly above, sorry, I didn't mean to skip ahead there, slightly higher than 2, but on average I was seeing 2-to-1 file size ratios with the latest builds, and I'll have those build numbers in just a moment. And of course, like I just mentioned, you can start playing with X.265 today. You don't have to pay anyone any money if you want to start doing R&D. And most people that I've talked to at the conference so far aren't using 265 in a production scenario. It's just not ready for most production scenarios. The one production scenario I was hoping to demonstrate in my workshop yesterday, but it's still in preview release with Wowza, and I'm not blaming Wowza for this, but I was demonstrating X.265 coming out of FFmpeg from my webcam here and being played by VLC. So I think that's going to be the first game that we'll see, live streaming, where you have bandwidth compromise. This event is a perfect example. Even though we're in the middle of Manhattan, bandwidth is always at a premium when you've got so many people using it. And pushing a stream out over 265 is going to require less bit rate for the same quality that you would have with 264. And just because someone can't play 265 on their phone yet consistently, I mean, there are some phones that are supporting 265. We can always transcode to 264 at ingest on the server, and that's, I think, a realistic workflow that we can start exploring today. Especially if you're working with smaller organizations where you've got maybe some flexibility in terms of you're not dealing with super large audiences where if you have to switch over to a 264 encoder at the last minute at a live event, it's not going to make or break the perceived quality of that stream or event. You'd want to be prepared for it. The bad news, of course, is pretty much the same, but the bad news keeps getting better in the sense that the encoding times are going down. when I first presented this just last May, the builds that I was using of 265 and 264, there was a difference of 7 to 1. It took 7 times as long to encode the same footage to the same output dimensions. Again, trying to keep compression parameters as simple as possible so that there wasn't any influence under the hood. That's gone. And even just with my own tests, I haven't changed the metrics on my own testing in terms of what I've used on the command line. So, apples being apples, just even on my own setup, I've seen these changes. So, even withstanding, and that's been interesting again for me. I just now have historical data that I can compare against. So, I think there's still a nice curve. I don't know when we'll stop seeing these improvements happening with H.265. There's probably some more room for it to improve. As we see, there's still improvements to H.264. I mean, I'm seeing smaller file sizes, marginally smaller, but it's going to plateau eventually. But right now, I'm still seeing some nice acceleration and improvements. We've gone from last May, where again 7 to 1, and then in November when I presented at Stream Media West, it was 3.5 to 1, and today it was 3 to 1. So it wasn't reduced by nearly the same factor, and again, it's all been just on the same laptop that I'm using here. And again, the real time, the other ratios, what I call HD real time ratio, H.264 was encoding faster than real time with the basic parameters that I was using. Of course, encoding is encoding. I can get super fast encoding times. I was demonstrating yesterday just with FFmpeg, if I use a very fast preset versus a very slow preset, you're going to, just by their names alone, we're looking at wildly differing times. But again, just using historical data based on my past tests, just how these numbers are changing. So like I said, even H.264 continues to make improvements. H.265 was originally a 5 to 1 ratio with real time. So that was, if you had a 2-minute clip, it would take 10 minutes to encode. That was cut down to 2.66 to 1 in November, and now we're at 2.24 roughly. I mean, again, I'm not sending too much content through my tests. I'm encoding the same clips over and over again. Again, just trying to keep apples to apples, the same trailer. So it's getting more dated. You saw it was an X-Men trailer. I didn't pick some new trailer because I just wanted to use the same source files as I'm going through these tests. And I'll just add that I know Jan Ozer recently has been in some of his sessions and his writing in Stream Media. He's been using that tool out of Russia to do, more quantifiable metrics on the picture. All of my stuff that has been solely to glean these kind of real-world numbers that matter in terms of production workflows, and not so much about PSNR and all these other values that you can, get mathematical measurements on. I mean, I think the difference is night and day enough when you're just looking at the picture to see that there's clearly differences to be had. And if you wanted to explore those differences on a finer level, by all means, you can and get numbers to support it. And of course, I mentioned this earlier when I first opened up that it's really mobile that I'm most concerned about. Getting GPU support for 265 in mobile is going to be the next big hurdle. That's just going to take time. I mean, thankfully. I shouldn't say thankfully, because when you think about how quickly we go through technology, we throw away phones. Hopefully they get reused by some other person. But we upgrade our phones quite frequently compared to our desktops and other machines. So the uptick will be. I think the traction for 265 won't be a very long cycle, but we're talking 1 or 2 phone purchases away from where we're going to need the mass, where it's probably going to be taking over the numbers at 264. And plus, we're always going to need 264 compatibility. I should say always, but for the foreseeable future, it's not like there's going to be some hard switch. I was just talking to Jeff Tapper, who's here presenting on Dash topics. It's not like Dash is the end-all savior. You're still going to need HLS support, right? Because if you don't have Dash support in some other vendor's browser, then you're going to need whatever that browser supports. So it's just one more element to enter the cog of, all the cogs that we have playing in the system. 265 is no different. It's not like it's going to just replace everything. And again, battery life, that's probably my biggest concern right now. If you're doing CPU decoding, you're not going to be able to watch a 2-hour movie on your phone very long, or just sit there and have last thing before I think I get into, oh no, I have a couple more slides. I will start getting into the demos in the last half. But I'm leaving sentences in my slides here that I've presented in the past. Back in November, they had just finalized licensing, and the interesting thing out of that now, compared to H.264, content owners don't have to worry as much as they did with 264 now with 265, and that's and this is when I'm talking. This isn't related to H.265 licensing. There's all sorts of myriad complexity, a myriad of. What am I trying to say? There's complexities around licensing, different aspects of licensing. The licensing I'm talking here is specifically just for the codec in general that MPEG-LA administrates. So as of now, the licensing that's been finalized is, and I can't remember what year it goes through to, but we don't have to worry about this paid versus unpaid content scenario that we currently have with 264, right? If you're just playing videos on a web blog and you're not charging people to watch them, you're not getting subscriber revenue, it's not ad supported, whatever, you generally don't have to worry about 264. But the minute you start making money from video that's encoded with H.264, you may have to start looking into the legalities of what's going on with your usage. I guess the good news and bad news with HEVC or H.265 is that it's only the encoders and decoders of the world that have to worry about licensing. So if you're in the business of encoding video or in the business of decoding video, then you're going to have to worry about royalties. But if you're a content owner or someone who's responsible for getting content out there, your concern is only going to be in those two areas I just mentioned. You don't have to worry about tracking royalties to MPEG-LA. And again, it's like taxes. It's an honor system, right? It's not like you can't use these codecs unless you sign up with some, form. You just go out and start using it, and if you're a big company, they'll likely come after you if you're not paying a licensing fee, right? If you're laying low under the radar, you're probably okay. Not that I'm encouraging you to, intentionally break the law, but these legal matters, even Fraunhofer MP3, there's licensing around it that, most garage bands of the world that are selling their CDs or selling songs in MP3 format may be ignoring. I'm going to start getting into my demos on the next slide, I believe. But so what I would recommend that you do today, I showed in my workshops yesterday, don't be afraid of compiling. If you don't know, compiling is important because it lets you have access to the latest and greatest enhancements. It's super easy to compile software on the Mac. It's not so easy to compile it on Windows. If you need to, you can even just start up a cloud instance on AWS and compile there, do your testing there. If you have Windows, it's just a lot of work to get code to compile on Windows. Once you get a workflow down, it's okay. But literally on a Mac, even if you don't know anything about terminal, you can follow step-by-steps on ffmpeg.org on how to compile ffmpeg on your Mac. The same with it's now including how to compile H.265. So even ffmpeg's own documentation walks you through how to compile H.265. Prior to the last two times I presented this, I was compiling my own VLC player because on the Mac I had to use a release to have 265 support that wasn't their stable release. Now the stable release includes 265 playback, so you can just download it on most platforms. You don't have to worry about compiling it. But you're going to be so used to compiling, right, that it's not going to be a problem to compile yet another tool, right, VLC. And again, just I mentioned live streaming as one of the avenues where I feel 265 could be utilized in a production capacity today. Maybe not if you're MTV, but again, if you're doing internal corporate streaming, I've done work for clients the size of Intuit or that do massive amounts of internal streaming just for their sales force, just for their internal teams. Never sees the light of day outside of their own networks. If you're in those kind of positions, I would say, and you've got stakeholder approval on trying some experimental stuff, give it a whirl. Be on top of your game. I would even say you could explore using it as an archive or mezzanine format right now. But again, we're still seeing these nice progressions with it. So, if you started to archive content last year, you wouldn't be seeing the benefit of today's code base that is doing it even better. So, and when I say archive mezzanine format here, more for R&D purposes, not for like converting your entire library over to it. I don't think it's ready for anything like that unless you're only going to be in business for a few months and you're out of it. But okay, so here were my testing specifications. I'm using a more recent version of OS X in this month's trial versus the last two trials I've done. You can see the HEVC encoder version I'm using of 265 is one of the latest commits. The interesting thing about 265, it looks like they're maintaining both Git and Mercurial repositories. They seem to be in sync, so just if you grab from either repository, you should be okay. I was mentioning in my workshop, one of the things that can be dangerous when you're compiling software is making sure, and you may have more than one version of FFmpeg. If you've downloaded FFmpeg from other sources and you start compiling it, always make sure you just do simple things. I'm going to break out and just go into terminal right now and show you. I think I've got a good point size here still from yesterday. Well, that's just a public key. That's no harm there. It wasn't a private key, but I'll just start a new window. If you go FFmpeg-version, it's going to tell you right away what the compiled version is on my machine of FFmpeg right now. That's an interesting string. It doesn't really matter much to me what that version string is as long as it matches what I have in my checked out source for FFmpeg. So I'm just going to show you real quick that if I go into my project folder where I'm keeping this. Let me just get there real quick. So if I do a git describe on this on my local copy, thankfully they're tagging these commits well enough that I can see some nice matching up here. So what really matters here is that I'm seeing the last 8 digits of the hash match up with the last 8 digits here. So I know that the FFmpeg that I'm running, just when I call FFmpeg straight from the command line, matches up with my repo. That's great, because that means I compiled what I have downloaded. That doesn't mean I have the most recent repo local pull or local copy of what's on the public servers, and the same would go for H.264 and H.265. Unfortunately, if I go into the H.264 repo I have, and if I try to do a git describe, it's going to tell me that there's no names found. They didn't put any names in the repo like they did with FFmpeg, so if I'm just going to bring up my notes, I have it from yesterday here. So if I just do a git show, if I say git show instead of git describe, I'm going to get some information. More importantly, it's going to show me the commit string right here, and I will see the same. It's the first 8 digits I'm going to see in the H.264 compiler are from them. If I do compression, let me get out of this, sorry. Quit. If I run FFmpeg right now with just a sample, I'm just going to do a quick sample encode here with that xmen file that I've been using, just to show you that when I specify libx264, and I'm just going to output I'm just going to copy the audio, and I'm just going to go, let's overwrite if I've got some temp file here that I used before. As soon as I do this, and I'm going to just break out of it and scroll up, libx264 reports right here the parameters it's using. It's giving me the version string right there. So I want to make sure that H.264 is lining up with my repository 121396C. If I go back to the command line that I executed before, sorry, let me break out. I'll get out of there. If I go back to git show, that lines up with the digits I see here. So again, I've got some sense of assurance that I'm doing using, that what I'm compiling is what I've grabbed from the repo, and I don't want to go through that same step, but it's exactly actually is a little better with H.265 on the Git repository. I don't know about Mercurial, but if I go into H.265, and I do a git describe on the tags, I will get the latest version that way with H.265. At least it's something that's tagged that I don't have to look at the actual commit log to get a sense of what's going on. So 1.6, etc. I'll get the same kind of matching in FFmpeg when I start an H.265 in code. So I can compare there. So it's important to do that because I thought I had compiled the latest 264 when I was doing this test last week, and then I just double checked. I'm like, oh, I didn't clean it out. One of the steps that I think some folks rush is to make sure they clean up their make files after they do a check and they do a make. There's a make argument called dist clean, which means clean up the distribution. Make sure you run that. Don't omit any of the steps in the FFmpeg tutorials because it will just make sure you don't have anything left lingering around that might influence a later compile. Just good practice to be involved with. With that being said, let's. I think I have. Yep, it's demo time finally. And again, this is going to be very. If you've come to this session in the past, there's really no great surprise here. It is always just nice to have some visuals and some assurances that they haven't broken anything. So moving forward, all the results are seeming. All the data seems to continue to support what we've come to believe through the what we've heard about 265, in that we're getting better picture quality at the same bit rate, or if we're using the same, if we reduce bit rates, that we can get a higher quality than we would have with H.264. So without further ado, I have VLC open, and I'm going to just go ahead and run I think the most telling, what I like to do is, as a matter of practice, is reduce bit rate. Like on a 720p, let's just crank it down to 500K and see which encoder does a better job when it comes to having, 500K is not a great bit rate to use for 720p content, unless it's just a white wall that you're taking a picture of, or shooting a moving picture of, I guess I should say. So I'll go ahead and start with the 264 X-Men trailer. And again, this is 720p. At 500K. So if I start playing this, you're going to see lots of artifacting. I don't know, can we take the lights down? Is it possible? No?
Professor?
You're going to find this hard to believe.
I was sent here for you.
From the future?
50 years from now.
Just you'll see the blockiness on the fades and the fades that
Stay
fade in and fades out, like anything where you're seeing
In
the
the
flesh
beginning,
tones even.
The Sentinels were just targeting mutants.
This one's really casting.
And they began targeting everyone. They've come a long way to guide us, to bring us together. The X-Men. We need your help.
Tell whoever it was that sent you, I'm busy.
The person who sent me was you.
And I'm actually going to back it up because I picked this trailer specifically because I really like some of these complex scenes at the very beginning. So notice when the lights come on in this hallway, just how blocky this looks in
Professor?
In
You're gonna find
264.
this hard to believe.
That was pretty
sent here
blocky.
for
I mean,
you.
even from a
From the
distance.
future?
You should have
50
seen
years
that.
from now.
And now if I play
Give me
that
that
same
one more time,
segment in
please.
265, which I think I should have queued up here in the 265. Again, file size is about the same because it's just bit rate, right? I mean, it doesn't matter what codec I use. If I use 500 kilobits as a bit rate, then hopefully, it's honoring that. And I'll blow this up. And look how much better 265 is with that same concept.
Professor?
You're gonna find this hard to believe.
I was sent here for you.
It looks
From
a
the
lot. I
future,
mean, you can notice the
50 years
difference,
from
right?
now.
Even from a distance, that we're not
Give me
seeing
that one
nearly.
more
I mean,
time,
it's
please.
still not,
Stay with me.
super sharp. I mean, if you compare
the
this to
beginning,
the original
the
trailer,
Sentinels were
there's
just
clearly
targeting
artifacting going on here.
And
that
they began
wasn't
targeting
original.
everyone.
But it's far less so. So I mean,
They've come a
what's
long
interesting
way
about
to
this is
guide
that
us, to
in
bring
the
us
past
together.
we used to
The
think of
X-Men.
lower mobile bit rates as
We need your
horrible
help.
looking.
Tell whoever
and I
it
think
was that
they won't
sent
be
you, I'm
nearly as
busy.
horrible looking when we
person who
start
sent
using
me
265.
was
So
you.
that's good news, right? The fact that I can get this trailer looking that good at 500K at a 720p resolution. I mean, what's interesting, and I think as a trend, so many people have encoding workflows. I mean, so many big companies, media companies, have in place encoding workflows that were set years ago, and they haven't touched them, right? And H.264 made lots of improvements over those years that they didn't take any advantage of. So it's not going to be very hard those people could take their same workflow and just probably tweak some H.264 parameters, and they'd see a lot better bang for their buck. There's no doubt about it. And so the reason I mention that is I think there's going to be plenty of people who think H.265 is responsible for this massive explosion in quality, when if they had just been doing H.264 up to date, they probably would have seen some of these gains, and it wouldn't be such a night and day difference. I mean, and to that effect, based on feedback that I've had from past sessions of this, I have done more tests in the sense that, well, if you gave H.264 as much time as you're giving H.265 to do these decisions for encoding, what happens to the quality? And you do get better quality. Like if I show you now, I'm going to ask you to keep the lights down because I have a few more demos to do. Can we get the lights back down? Is it super impossible to get the lights down? We have to make phone calls to the president. Let's do it one more time. I'll tell you when to bring them back up. I know even if I'm underexposed, I'd rather have the video look good. You don't need to see my mug. Let me bring up the very slow. So this is, the only thing that I changed in this encoding param. And if you want my shell scripts to see how I'm encoding this, whatever, just grab them from me. But here's the, it does improve when I give H.264 more time, right? And this is why I'm saying if people just took a look at their encoding workflows right now, chances are there's a huge room. I mean, a lot of people aren't even using H.264. They're using a main concept or some other H.264 codec for compression. So is it plain? Go. There it goes. So, I mean, I don't have a side-by-side little diagram here to show you the difference, but
Professor?
this is
Hard to
H.264.
believe.
It looks better than that other one I showed you.
I was sent here for
but
From the future,
that had
50 years from now.
I wasn't using the very
Give me
slow
that one
preset.
more
So
time, please.
If I give
Stay with
H.264 enough time, it's still going
In the
to
beginning,
do better.
the Sentinels were just targeting
not
mutants.
as good as H.265.
And they began targeting
but
everyone.
This is, proof that
Come a long way
encoding is all
to
about
guide us,
finessing
to
and
bring us
knowing
together.
the
The
parameters
X-Men.
that go into your process.
We need your
And
help.
if you're willing
Tell
to
whoever
give-
it was that
you
sent
know,
you. I'm
these
busy.
should be business decisions in
The
the sense
person
that
who
if
sent
you're
me
willing to invest
was
in
you.
more processing time to use 265, well, what are you? Clearly, 264 could
all of
still
us
hold up to
end
similar
this war.
rationale as well. If you're willing to
You're
give it
beast.
more.
I don't know what
coding
you're
time.
talking about.
There are still differences though, and I'll just show you. I mean, you can even just see here in my Finder display. Don't bring up the lights yet. I got one more I'm going to show, unless you can flip it on and off real quick, which seems to be a problem. Let's just leave them dim. I did. This is just using CRF. Sorry, I'm having a problem reading at the moment. But just using CRF 21 as a arbitrary default value. If I encode 265 with a CRF of 21, I'm down to 47.3 megabytes. I know it's a little small there, but trust me. I mean, I showed you those file size ratios earlier. So that same, and that's at the 1920 by 816 resolution that's native to the source. So I'm seeing a 47.3 megabyte file size on 265. If I try to do an apples for apples encode, well, it is almost twice as big for the X-Men version of it, right? 81.3 megabytes. But if I use very slow, I'm able to get some savings out of there. 72.8 meg. That's clearly a significant enough drop in file size and bit rate that it warrants consideration. So, but is it 47.3 megabytes? No, it's still significantly higher than 265. So I don't think you'll ever be able to get 264 to be as performant in terms of an encoder as you can 265. Sorry, let me start over. I don't think you'd be able to tweak 264 enough to get the quality gains that you have with 265, but you can definitely reduce that margin more and more if you just start investigating encoding more. I'm just going to show one more trailer, and this one will be, instead of using bitrate, I'll just show CRF to prove more to the point that even though the file size is reduced with 265, that we're getting the quality. I mean, this is where it is almost a 2-to-1. We're looking at 53 megabytes versus 27 megabytes. So this was a trailer for God's Pocket, and I'm going to play the 264 one. And again, this isn't, you're not going to see any difference in quality on this one. This is going to be one where it's CRF, so I'm basically telling it.
You're telling me there was something wrong with the horse
so
made
the
a quick
quality I'm
300
seeing on
yards from the finish?
264
She hit the stretch and just quit. Turns out she sucked up air,
So the goal of
a
this
couple
test
gallons
is
of air
that we
get
should
trapped
see
up in there.
parity
She cramps
between
up
the two
and she
versions.
can't
The
run.
only difference is bit rate,
Very
file
uncommon.
size, and it's clear that the 265
The working
is
men
smaller.
of God's Pocket
I like
are
the color
simple
palette in this one.
They
it's
work,
muted, and it,
marry, and have children.
Some of the shadows
And
on
until
this
recently,
really, you get the gradients
die like
where you can
everyone
see
else.
the artifacting come out.
22-year-old construction
more than
worker
you
was
would
killed
in another
yesterday when he
clip.
slipped and fell
So
to his
I'm just
death.
gonna
Leon
play
Hubbard
till
didn't
that
slip on
point.
nothing.
And then
Something happened to Leon.
I'll show you the 265 just again to show you that when it comes to more of a CRF comparison, that we're, it's not like we're going to see 265 fall apart here for that fall for the small file size. It's going to be equivalent. You may even say it's marginally better in some areas. Sorry, I always forget with the screen that it's whether it's plain or not. I have to give it.
You're
5
telling me
seconds.
there was something wrong with the horse made a quick 300 yards from the finish?
She hit
But
the
of course,
stretch
we
and
have,
just quit. Turns
there
out
there
she
is something
sucked
that's
up
more
air,
expensive happening right now
a
on
couple
my machine,
gallons
and that is
of air
higher
get
CPU
trapped up in there, and she
utilization,
cramps
in order
up
to
and she
decode
can't
each
run.
of these frames.
Very
More of my
uncommon.
CPU on my Mac is being used to do this. So
The working men of God's
even though
Pocket
there's
are simple
not
men.
as much of a
They
visual
work,
difference here,
marry,
there is a CPU. There's
and have
still
children.
a cost for me
until
to
recently,
have used this codec. I had to
they
wait
die
longer
like
for
everyone
this
else.
encode to come out.
22-year-old
and,
construction
I'm using
worker
up
was
more
killed
CPU
yesterday when
in
he
order
slipped
play
and
it
fell
back.
to his death.
Those
Leon Hubbard didn't
parts,
slip on
that
nothing.
latter half of the
Something
equation,
happened to Leon over at that
presumably
job.
the first
Something
part too
nobody's
is,
told us
we
yet.
make gains with
I'll see what I can
GPU,
find out.
over the years,
Jimmy's got some idea that something else happened on that early on. I was hoping you could ask around for me.
If I have a
You want me to
beefier
talk this out?
machine, it's going
wanna
to be
make
faster
Jeannie
all
feel
with
better.
everything I encode, right? So it's not just specific.
Can I help you?
I'm Richard Shelburne of the Daily Time.
And with that, I want to leave room for questions that I might be able to entertain. Questions? Yes? Sorry, what was that? Well, I mean, H.265 if something's encoded in one flavor, as long as it's adhering to the spec, I don't need an H.265 decoder. But more importantly, is there an HEVC decoder out there? The most popular way for 265 content to be decoded is with the DivX plugin right now. And so, that's no different than a flash scenario. So there's no native browser support for 265, and that's a big difference with VP9. I even showed, I can pull up my diagram before. Actually, I'll bring that up. It's from my player workshop yesterday. It's basically an updated chart from what I had in an older article I did for Streaming Media Magazine. I did these flow charts that basically show where things are supported. And one of the changes I made this year for this version of the workshop was adding VP9. I couldn't add H.265 here, right? Because there's no native browser support for it, whereas at least with VP9, sure, Google's behind it, the open source community's behind it. So Firefox and Chrome now have versions that will natively decode VP9 for you. But the problem with VP9 is more industry adoption, right? It's just, it's probably, and I don't want to be some doomsday kind of guy, but it's likely to suffer the same fate as VP8, right? In the sense that if you don't have, most of my clients care most about iOS first, Android second, and then desktop third, right? And so in that order of priority, and that's largely a perceptual one, even if the numbers say that there's more Android phones out there than iOS phones, the perception in terms of a brand, in terms of who wants to announce that they're only on Android? No one wants to announce that, right? That doesn't sound cool. So, it's, and that just seems to be how stakeholders make their decisions these days. They first and foremost want things to work on iOS Secondly, on Android, I mean, maybe they're equal on those, however you want to shake that out. But and so that's why I joke in some of my earlier sessions that, if you don't have buy-in from Apple, then it's a non-starter, right? So it's, I'm not saying there can't be a use case for other codecs, but decision making should not be based on standards. Standards are there to help guide the conversation, but at the end of the day, it's about eyeballs and who are you reaching and how much money are you spending to reach those eyeballs. So if I'm only going to gain an insignificant margin of viewership because I spent a lot more effort to get out to someone who refuses to install a plugin on Firefox, I mean, what is the margin of my market that is represented by this person who refuses to, who is this person, right? Is it the disgruntled HTML5 web developer who only has a browser that, is singular in focus? I don't know. I'm joking, but I think you get my drift, is that, you make decisions based on business requirements, and if your business requirements can support those decisions, then great, everyone's going to be happy. And I couldn't tell you what's going on in Apple deep down, but if their track record is any indication, I would say, we're not going to see VP8 or VP9. I think we already know that FaceTime is using 265 on the latest versions of iPhone, and I don't know if that's I haven't gotten the details to know if that's a software level implementation. I have to imagine they're, again, if you're doing software level decoding on a phone or encoding, that's a pretty heavy hit on your phone. So you're not going to get a whole lot of battery out of that transaction, but or you're going to use a whole lot of battery out of that transaction, I should say. The one, and again here, just the this is an even smaller diagram. I apologize for how small it is on this display. I didn't update this should actually have VP9 in that spectrum too with MPEG Dash. Last year when I was presenting, MPEG Dash really didn't have the traction that we're starting to finally see this year. Video.js has a Dash component to it now. JW Player is they've had it in labs momentarily. Now, I'm not saying that Dash goes hand in hand with codecs. Dash is codec agnostic, but they're often lumped together, right? I mean, the conversations. And so I think it will be interesting once we, again, I think the way that the industry shifts, they take these, they don't typically move in little steps, right? They wait and then they make a big decision and switch over. So I think when we're ready to see sort of an MPEG Dash switch over, once the browser traction is there, I mean, there's some nice things that Dash is going to do across the board for browsers that support it. I mean, we were demoing yesterday in the workshops, just like, if you're using HLS in a mobile browser, you're leaving it in Apple's hands or whoever is parsing your HLS. What's going on with the bitrate. You don't even know. You can't even track an event in JavaScript to know if there's a bitrate change. It's nothing that is exposed as an event. With Dash, we'll have a lot, it's funny, I made a joke yesterday that I think finally web developers will know the pain of Flash developers because they think they've built video players in HTML5. People haven't had to build video players. They've had to pass URLs to a tag. Now with Dash and MSE and the encrypted media extensions, you're able to do the same sorts of things you could do in the Flash world, which is build a video player, right? You're controlling all the logic that goes into bitrate switching. Technically speaking, you have access to way more stream metrics now than you did with something like HLS. So I'm looking forward to that. I mean, specifically to being able to point at web developers and say, "Ha! Now you really know why Flash was important because we could do these things that you're now only seeing are capable in a system like Dash has." But so it'll be interesting. I mean, what's great is that we already have folks like Jeff Tapper and the contributions that are being made by the community to Dash. That there's going to be some nice libraries that people can utilize to make Dash consumption easier. The problem is still going to be vendor support, just getting the vendors up there. And when you have decisions from Microsoft where browser upgrades are tied to OS upgrades, that doesn't make the situation any easier, especially for those of us who have clients in government or municipalities where upgrading operating systems is not an easy task, right? I mean, that's a lot of money. I mean, that's where I still yearn from the old days of Flash, where getting an organization to update a new Flash player version was relatively simple. It was a small download. Sure, you might need admin rights. Changing operating systems to just get a browser update is a bit of a problem. So, yes. It's a good question to bring up. Admittedly I haven't had any testing in that realm, but if going by what's being said, we should see some interesting things come out in that vein. So, specifically with parallel processing, that's definitely that's a game changer. I don't really have anything to add to what you said, but I'm glad you brought it up. Well, any other questions, comments? How many people? I asked in my workshops. How many people have specifically like on a FFmpeg H.264, H.265 level? How many people have already started to play around with H.265? And don't be shy. I know there's always like a few people like trying to raise their hand. So enough people. That's good. How many people plan to? I saw like a survey. In the next 3 to 6 months, do you plan to? Okay, that's good. That's good. There's no reason why you shouldn't start understanding it a little better now. I think like any tech that we have to deal with, if by the time it's ready for adoption, you're only deciding to look into it then you're probably doing yourself a disservice. So, but you're already here in this workshop or this session and here at Stream Media, so presumably you're not like that. So that's good news, right? Excellent. Yes, one question. Oh gosh, I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine, but I honestly, like I said, I think the mobile market's going to dictate that. The quicker we see phones coming out that support it, the desktop, it's a lot easier to get away with it. We used Flash for years without GPU acceleration, hogging the processor. Heck, you could still be running YouTube and Flash and hear your fan kick in, right? So I think it's really a mobile equation at this point. Once we see mobile traction and mobile browser support, then that's when we know the traction's there. That was another joke I made, just how much stakeholders have changed their mindset. I remember the days like when Flash Player 7 was going to Flash Player 8 and having Sony in an office saying like, well, we want to wait till we see like 90% penetration of Flash Player 8. Really? I don't see you using that same logic with HTML5. Are you going to wait for 90% penetration for any of these technologies? We're not there yet with most of them, and they're still in use, right? So it's just we have such a fragmented market. Nothing's cheaper anymore, right? If anything, budgets have to be more expensive because there's so much fragmentation. You have to make sure things work on so many different devices that you have to implement so many different workflows to address those in your production pipeline. And that's not going away, unfortunately. unless there's some monopoly that comes along and just gobbles everything up. It's just going to be the way things are. And Flash shielded us at Silverlight too from that kind of thinking. It was the normalizing force. I think that's going to be the big game changer too. If we saw Adobe make an announcement that said we're going to put H.265 into the regular player, because right now I think they've just been talking about primetime having it, and Adobe has that control. Historically, you can have the Flash player on your machine, and then you can unlock bits in it if you've got different things going on. So you download a few extra bits. That's how some of the P2P stuff started out with Flash Player back in the day. And so if Adobe, maybe it's going to be DivX, I don't know. If someone comes out that makes a plugin free and it becomes ubiquitous enough on desktop, then I think that's going to be a game changer. Because right now, I honestly don't think H.264 would be in the position it is today if it wasn't for Flash. How many scenarios rely on a Flash fallback, especially with legacy browsers. So 265 is going to be in that same boat, right? If we have something that can be leveling the playing field for vendors that choose not to support it, that's big. And if we don't have someone stepping up to do that with 265, that could also, I think it's going to be like a 1%, 99% kind of thing. Like the people that can afford to put 265 into their workflow, they maybe will augment it and take the gains that they can with it, but they're still going to need to support H.264 for a vast number of use cases. So that's how so those factors going into it. I don't know. I wish I could say by the next time I'm up at this podium in May next year that we'd see more use of it publicly, but I don't think it's going to be as soon as next May that suddenly we're going to see like an explosion of 265 content out there. So maybe I'm wrong. And again, I think it's going to, certain organizations will make a leap sooner than others, and then they may lead the charge because they've got the ability to do that. But I don't think it's, it's going to be a bit of a waiting game still. I think I'd sooner put my expectations behind Dash, and Dash being implemented sooner than 265 as a format protocol, because again, Dash is codec agnostic. So I'm excited about those gains that we'll see. I still worry about live streaming to a certain extent. So much of what I do with my day-to-day work still has Flash in a live streaming scenario being very critical to the success of that part of the equation. So, and especially low latency live streaming. HTTP just wasn't really designed. You can reduce packets to a sliver, but you're really throwing out encoding. At that point, it's a little insane. So, yeah. I'm going to have this fan here. I caught half of what you just said, so you'll have to speak up.
I was saying, what do you see the long-form intent with the chip side actually getting prices out, or do you feel it's more the software?
I don't know if I could split that in some kind of proportion. I think that they're both going to be important equally. I don't know. It's hard to say, but I definitely think mobile chipsets are going to, they could certainly lead the charge. In terms of, because that's where we need the bitrate reductions the most, is mobile, right? So the faster we get these things to mobile, the better. Desktop connections can be just as horrible sometimes too. We've all been there, but in our home, our offices, and seen connections suffer. But I think the mobile chipset side of it is probably the more appealing side of it when it comes to better quality over lower bit rates, because we're talking lower data utilization. It's still not cheap. Anytime I'm in Canada, I'm reminded of how expensive bandwidth is, and it's just, mobile bandwidth in general is not cheap. So but I think I'm at the end of my session. So thank you for your time, and thank you for coming.